don't do a lot of camera reviews, but when I heard about new French manufacturer Pixii and their concept of rangefinder camera, I found it very interesting. I did some search online, looked at the reviews that were available, and after spending a few weeks with the camera itself, I thought that I have observations that's slightly different than what's presented online, so I wanted to share those. I have the latest version of APS-C version of Pixii camera. They just started releasing their full frame version, and I haven't had a chance to play with this one. Camera is positioned as obviously something for those who are interested in true rangefinder concept. The only other option available is Leica, currently at M11. And this is viewed as a budget alternative to Leica. Now, when we're talking about budget and rangefinder, you have to take this statement somewhat advisedly. So yes, it's true that APS-C crop sensor Pixii starts at around $3,000 and more for cameras with more built-in memory. It's definitely much cheaper than $8,000 M11, but it's not cheap. As an example, I can get Nikon ZF full frame camera, which is a great camera, very tactile, a lot of manual controls for $2,000. Obviously, there is large number of APS-C cameras, so it's not budget. It's only budget if you really determined to get a rangefinder camera, and Leica is somewhat out of your range. One of the most interesting things about Pixii, and frankly the reason why I'm holding this camera in my hand, is the fact that it's a modular camera. You can buy the current version, and this version is upgradable to the later versions. You can start with the first initial version APS-C and buy upgrades all the way to this one, and this camera in its own turn can be upgraded to Max, to the full frame version, for $1,500. So I thought that's great to get some experience, some exposure to this camera, see what it feels like, and in the future, if I really like it, I can always upgrade to a newer, larger sensor, more featureful version of the camera. That's great, and I wish more camera manufacturers would be offering this as an option. Now, in terms of the camera itself, it does not look like a prototype product. It looks reasonably well manufactured. Frankly, most of the modern cameras are very well manufactured, even at entry-level points, so it's comparable to some of the main manufacturers' cameras. It definitely doesn't feel like a Leica, that feels like a single piece of metal that's camera made out of, but it's quite polished, seemed very carefully manufactured, no complaints here. Now, in terms of handling the camera, the first thing that strikes you is there is absolutely no grip. So I hope you have very good tactile strength, because you'll need it when operating the camera. I wish there would be a little bit more of a grip surface or something like a grip for more positive control. Furnishing is good, but it actually does feel a bit plasticky, the back, and it has no LCD, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. It's kind of plasticky. There are also plastic surfaces where rangefinder is, and at the top LCD panel. Nothing horrible. It smudges a little bit, which I find somewhat aesthetically annoying, but absolutely not a deal breaker. The rest of it is good. Now, when we switch to controls, that's where it becomes interesting. So the shutter button is this button right here. It flat flush with the top panel. Very difficult to know when you have your finger on this button. Now, mind you, this camera does not have a mechanical shutter, and this button is basically a mouse button and feels like a mouse button. So both finding it in a tactile sense is difficult, and when you're clicking it, the only feedback, there's a little bit of a depression, not a lot, and also there is a, I assume, speaker generated sound, because there is no mechanical pieces that are moving when you're pressing this button. That's a shutter button. The big dial right next to it is shutter speed dial. It has automatic setting. I don't know if it's easy to see, designated with an A. The dial is nice and easy to use, but also it's not locking. And I find that more often than not, that's when I pull it out of the camera, I got knocked off the previous setting, and I always need to be careful to double check it to make sure that it's not in some random position. Now, at this level of camera, I would expect to have much more definitive control, either locking or something that's a little bit harder to manipulate. In terms of buttons, there is only 2 additional controls. This looks like 3 buttons, but this one is actually USB-C port. It's an interesting positioning because you would think that this is really prime real estate. It's right under your grip, and you absolutely do not need USB-C port there. As an example, my Leica M11 has port right here on the bottom plate. So when you're transferring images or when you're charging the camera, you're not operating it, so it doesn't matter if it's laying flat. Here it's a prime real estate, and I'm a little bit surprised that they chose to put the charging port there. Now, the cover itself is a little bit flaky. After using it for a while, it's difficult to get it positively closed. I hope something that they can work on. So besides that, there is these 2 other controls. There is the super multifunctional button right here. This button is both, if you do a short press, it gives you the battery setting. And if you do longer press, let me try. Yep, it starts up the camera. So you can see your current setting at the top LCD. Now, as you noticed, it took me a couple of attempts to press this button for just long enough time to turn camera on. This is both surprising and annoying. I never seen a camera where on and off switch was something that flaky that you actually have to time. Usually it's very definitive flip on, flip off switch, very easy to manipulate. Now, after the camera is on, the same button becomes your menu button. It takes you into the menu. The menu is something from early 2000s. It's a linear menu, and the final control is the dial that allows you to go up and down the menu, and then you use the same menu power button to make your selection. So the whole menu experience is a little bit cumbersome. I am not used to actually having something like this on a camera. Camera typically has quite a few settings. Even rangefinder camera like this, there are still few things that you may want to change. And going through this menu is just a touch more than necessary in my opinion. Not a deal breaker at all. It's not that you need to actually go into the menu frequently enough. Basically everything you have is done either via the lens or via the shutter speed button. Now, what else is there in terms of controls? There is a cold shoe, not a hot shoe. There is no way to synchronize flash using this hot shoe, which is actually probably not a bad call. I wish it was a hot shoe just in case I chose to use a flash, but for most rangefinder users, flash is not a high priority. And hot shoe at the same time is pretty useful, and I'll show it in a little bit later. We typically mount optical viewfinders if you need different focal length, not supported by the primary viewfinder. So having the hot shoe is great. The fact that it's not a hot shoe, again, it's one of those weird omissions at this price point, but probably not relevant to absolute overwhelming majority of rangefinder users. Okay, what else is there? There is LCD that you've seen already that shows all of the primary settings. It's nice, crisp, very easy to get the sense of the settings at one glance. Besides that, there is this small panel that has 3 lights. One of the lights, blue light, shows that the camera is on, which is of no utility to me. I'm actually surprised that they have that. There is a link light that indicates that camera, I believe, linked to the phone application on the phone, which again, if I have my phone and I'm actually determined to use application, it's absolutely irrelevant what this light says. I can double check on the cell phone itself. And finally, there is a battery light, the bottom one, that turns red when you start getting low on the battery. Maybe it's a good additional check so you know when you're running low. But again, the top plate and I believe viewfinder also shows the battery when it gets low. So I don't find that super critical. But the most curious thing is this exposure indicator, this light right here. You see it's it's white right now. It can also show red errors when it's under or overexposed. This is really puzzling to me in several ways. So first of all, I do not know why in general I need this, because I see the same indications inside the rangefinder, inside the viewfinder itself, where it's much more logical to have it, because I have it on the subject, I'm operating the camera, and simultaneously I can see if I need to change my exposure level. Number two, even if I do need to see it, it's kind of under my grip here. Now you can see it because it just happens to be typically between your fingers, but still it's a pretty crowded space with your hand and not the most natural place to look. But perhaps there is some other way to operate camera that's not my style, where you have it hanging by the neck strap and you look down to see the exposure. This is not what I've done and how I use my rangefinder or any other camera really, but maybe somebody finds it useful. That's the only idea I have. Now, I'll touch on the viewfinder separately. Then there is a battery compartment at the bottom, similar to most cameras, including latest Leica M11. Great thing about this battery is that it's a standard Sony battery, so you can get those rather cheaply, 50 bucks or so for brand name one, and much cheaper if you're interested in going with third party. This is cheaper than $200, I believe, which is the going rate for Leica M11 battery. The surprising thing about this battery is how few exposures I get on a single battery. Now with Leica, I have only one battery. I never felt the need to have a second one, and it lasts several days of kind of as intense of a shooting as you can expect with Leica. Obviously, this is not a sports camera. You're not going to be getting 3,000-4,000 exposures a day, but you know, reasonable shooting with perhaps hundreds, maybe high hundreds in a single day, it can easily handle. This battery, in my experience, lasts somewhere between 200 to 150 images, which is very bizarre because there is no autofocusing, there is no mechanical thing moving inside the lens, there is no mechanical shutter, so basically it's just processing and operating, getting readouts from the sensor. So it's a little bit surprising that you get such little exposure count from a single battery. I got a couple of batteries. Usually I'm okay to go for a day or so of shooting with a couple of batteries. I probably will get more because you do get to the kind of low setting of the second battery after a few hours of walking around with the camera. Now, that's it in terms of setting, other than the rangefinder itself. Now, clearly, rangefinder is the main reason why anybody would consider this camera. If you're just interested in an optical viewfinder, there are DSLRs. There is Fuji X100 series, which has optical viewfinder, but not a true rangefinder. It still uses autofocus. So this camera is presumably only for people who are truly interested in real rangefinder experience. So the only camera I can compare it with is Leica in terms of cameras manufactured today. I have my Epson, which is one of my all-time favorite cameras, but they stopped manufacturing it in 2009. So perhaps it's not such a relevant comparison anymore. So in comparison to Leica, I find that both in terms of accuracy, distance between the two windows is very comparable to current M11. I know they modified it, they used to be closer together, but in the latest version of Pixii, it's about on parity with Leica. It would be great if they were even wider, so you could get even more precise focus, but as it stands, it compares quite reasonably to Leica. In terms of clarity of the viewfinder, which is very critical, Leica is a touch better. If you kind of compare them side by side, and I went through cleaning, making sure there are no smudges on either one of those, Leica is a little bit better. And also in terms of frame lines, Leica has automatic frame lines. I do not think they're digital lights, and brightness of those is always spot on. It's exactly where I would like it to be in different lighting conditions. Here you have adjustable brightness frame lines, and also you can set it to automatic or camera adjust them. But I do find them a touch too bright in low light setting, to the point where they borderline interfere with framing. But overall, not horrible. Again, it lives up to being slightly a budget version compared to Leica, but not too bad. The most puzzling thing to me was the focal length that those frame lines supported. So when I first heard that this is going to be digital frame lines, I figured they're going to support every possible setting. But given that it's APS-C camera, I expected in terms of millimeters for viewfinder to cover wider end. So Leica, I believe, goes up to 28 millimeters on the wide end and 135 on the telephoto end. So I expected to have comparable range of coverage from this camera, if not more. I was surprised that it only covers range from 28 millimeters to 50 millimeters. So 50 millimeters is equivalent to 75 on a full frame, is slightly telephoto, and honestly that's probably close to being enough for most rangefinder photographers. 28 millimeters at the same time is almost normal, not wide at all. I would expect this camera to go down to what's going on 28, something like 18 millimeters. But it does not. So that's both a little bit surprising and I guess kind of surprising not in a positive way. I would think that they would cover moderately wide angle lenses. Now, even with Leica, if you go for truly wide angle lenses, they both sell a special optical viewfinder and rangefinder that mounts on top. Sorry, it's not a rangefinder, but it does, I believe, check exposure. Or in the modern cameras that have live view, like M11, you can use a rear LCD for framing. Now, here, of course, there is no rear LCD, so there is no option to use it for framing. That's a little bit unfortunate, and I'll mention kind of the workaround that I came up with for this. In terms of information that you see in this optical viewfinder, it actually provides all of the critical information, which is great. I typically don't find super compelled to kind of look at the top panel after the initial setup. It gives my exposure, it gives all of the necessary settings in the viewfinder. So this piece is great. Now, I think in the later versions of APS-C, Pixii started selling the adjustable diopter eyepieces. Again, one of the really puzzling things for me, because if you ever used rangefinder, you have slightly suboptimal vision. It's a little bit puzzling to me because you have any vision that requires correction. It makes it very difficult to focus rangefinder with uncorrected optical viewfinder. So the fact that it took them, I believe, a couple of versions before they realized necessity of that is a little bit surprising. Also, the price point is not cheap. So this is on par with Leica. It's a $200 or so piece. I'm curious, I do not know if there is a technical optical reason for this, but most cameras, including Fuji X100, they have a wheel that allows you to adjust optical viewfinder for your vision. It would be great if cameras would have that, as opposed to making you pay $200 for additional adjustable viewfinder. It seems like we're already in a fairly premium category, and it makes sense for those things to come baked in, especially given how it's not that uncommon at all that people have different vision, different prescriptions. So in terms of wide-angle lenses for this camera, my favorite lens is this Leica 16-18-21 weight lens. It's super wide for full-frame Leica. On this camera, it's just plain wide-angle lens, so it's 16 maps to something like 24, and 18 is pretty close, it's 27, so pretty close to 28. So this covers your moderately wide-angle lenses for the camera. As I said, unfortunately, optical viewfinder that's built in does not allow you to focus, or I should say frame, with this lens at all. Luckily, I have this Zeiss 25-28 optical viewfinder. This is where a cold shoe actually comes in quite handy. This is really beautiful viewfinder, and comparing this to the rangefinder that you find here, this one is just so much clearer. Now, it's not really apples to apples comparison, because this optical viewfinder is just a single piece of glass. You have many more moving mechanical pieces in a rangefinder, but it would be great if rangefinder could have clarity of this one. Now, this doesn't cover obviously all three settings of this Leica lenses, but it covers 16, 18, which probably the more relevant ones. You can kind of guess and frame slightly less telephoto lens as well. So in combination with this, it works pretty well, but that means that you need to have another piece and you have to mount it, and also it becomes a two-step process. First you focus using the rangefinder, and then you switch to optical viewfinder to do the framing. Now, I wanted to share some thoughts on the decision of Pixii not to include the LCD. Now, Leica also makes, I think it's a D line of their flagship rangefinder cameras that do not have rear LCD. Some people obviously find it reminiscent of film photography, where you do not have instant review of the images. And I understand that. Unfortunately, both I find it kind of niche of already niche product. So not only you need to be extremely instant in rangefinder, now you're also looking for people who are interested in a rangefinder, not interested in a Leica for one or the other reasons, and also not interested in reviewing images on LCD. That's a very small target audience, and I do not know if that's kind of enough to sustain the whole brand. Mind you, for Leica, this is a fairly small run compared to M11, standard M11 with LCD. But Leica also makes lenses, they also make mirrorless cameras, they also make medium format cameras. So basically it's kind of much bigger company where they can accommodate the small run. For Pixii, this is the camera. As far as I know, they do not have plans to diversify and have additional offerings in the market. So that's one concern I have about this product decision. Number two, this is a fairly new camera, so there is a lot of things to work out. It doesn't quite give the same sense of confidence to the user. I would really appreciate being able to review images on an LCD, so I could see immediately if a focus is off, or I need to correct exposure, or I made some other mistake in camera settings. I am not one of those people who prefers not to have an LCD, and I think it would be useful. Now, given that the camera itself does not have an LCD, a lot of weight is put on Pixii application. Now, Pixii application, which I have, but I'm not going to show because there's really not that much to look at in detail. I saw some people praise it. In fact, somebody said that they wish Nikon and other cameras would have similar quality applications. To be honest, I have Nikon, I have many other cameras. I do not know how good their application is. I kind of do not care. I maybe used it a handful of times when I needed to transfer image and send it to somebody super urgently. Most of the time, everything I need to do is done in the camera itself. Reviewing images, settings, everything else really. So bar is very different for Pixii versus for Nikon and similar cameras. So to me, it's not very interesting to compare that. My overall impression of Pixii app is that, again, this is not quite as seamless as you would expect for application that needs to be used presumably more often with the camera. In the field where there is no Wi-Fi that both camera and cell phone can independently join, you're supposed to transfer all of the images using Bluetooth, which is very slow, and also you can download only preview, very low resolution images. There's absolutely no way to judge whether you hit the critical focus. Perhaps it's reasonable enough to judge exposure and color gamma, but that's about it. Also, I found that somewhat glitchy, where sometimes they would not connect. Sometimes I would set settings in an application, but they would not apply in a camera, and kind of all of that does not instill confidence. Obviously, if I need to go back and double check all of the settings that I did on my app in the camera, then I may as well just go through doing it in the camera. And there is a way to adjust all of the settings in the camera anyways. So I think there's a little bit of room for improvement there for Pixii. And again, another puzzling thing, just about every single camera I know today has its own Wi-Fi chip where it spins up a network that cell phone then joins. Pixii seemingly doesn't have this capability at the moment, so you need to have Wi-Fi that's generally available that both the devices would join. Seems like very weird and strange restriction. So this is a camera that relies on Wi-Fi more than any other camera, yet it has less functionality with respect to Wi-Fi than every other modern camera that I'm aware of. So that's interesting. Okay, so obviously the main reason why people are into photography is for taking images. So how good are the images? And both I spent some time using this camera for field trips, several weeks using it in ad hoc fashion. I also looked at some pictures that people present on the forums. So my impression is, yes, it's a modern sensor. It performs well, just as well as you would expect from modern APS-C sensor, reasonably good quality of images in low light. It's not anything more unique than that. It's not different architecture. It's not like Sigma Foveon sensor. You expect kind of what you expect from other APS-C sensors. And most of them are frankly very good. I rarely find that sensor is a limitation of what I'm trying to do photographically. That said, the color science of Pixii, I think it's still work in progress a little bit. I find kind of interesting yellow hue, something unnatural about colors. And this is very difficult to correct because we're not talking about white balancing, where it's just a white balance that you need to set. It's whole relationship of different colors to each other. I even looked if this was a CCD sensor, but no, it's a typical CMOS sensor, so it has to do with the processing primarily. Now, it reminds me either of kind of the way it looked in the older CCD cameras or a little bit in gamma you get from Foveon sensor. Not exactly, but Foveon sensor obviously is very different architecture, and the colors you get a result of how the sensor does the capture. Here I believe this is just processing and color science of Pixii, and this is something that can improve with the firmware. At least that's kind of my explanation, my understanding. The one thing that I did also find peculiar, I remember back in the day with older DSLR lenses, when I tried to use, not DSLR, but mirrorless lenses, mirrorless cameras, and I tried to use them with old rangefinder lenses, you typically get color cast. So Pixii produces color cast. By Pixii 1 is kind of modern camera, and those are typically optimized for rangefinder lenses. Also, I used it with array of very modern lenses, both Leica, Voigtlander, Typok, etc. And many of them produce zero cast on the full frame cameras. I used it both on my M11 and on Nikon. They do not produce color cast, but they do on Pixii, which is really strange because presumably this camera is optimized for rangefinder lenses. It cannot be used with anything else. Yet you still see this color cast, and color cast sometimes is quite noticeable. Some people like what it adds. It's kind of a form of vignetting. I prefer to add vignetting if I want to. I don't want camera to decide whether vignetting should be added, especially in the form of a color cast. So again, interesting, usually with older cameras that have to do with both lens formula and the fact that the sensor was thicker than the film. Now, this is a modern lens, Voigtlander, and again, it's one of those lenses where I see color cast, so it's not an issue with the lens anymore. And also, it's a little bit surprising if it's an issue with the sensor, because probably they're using one of the off-the-shelf sensors that produced by major sensor manufacturers and probably used in other cameras. So again, interesting, and something hopefully that they will focus on in the future iterations. The camera also has a monochrome mode. But the monochrome mode, unlike Leica monochrome, where it's a dedicated camera with a sensor where Bayer pattern color sensors are removed, here I believe it's just a filter that does processing. So I'm not sure why it's elevated to a separate mode as opposed to being one of the color filters you can apply. But I guess some people who really like black and white photography, maybe they find it advantageous in some way. Personally, I do not do a lot of black and white photography, so for me it's less relevant. So it doesn't bother me that it's there. It probably doesn't add too much functionality for people who are truly looking for this purest black and white that Leica provides in their black and white edition. So in terms of my final thoughts on the camera, I'm excited to see any new manufacturer enter the market. I have to say, camera market is uber competitive. We saw a lot of cameras enter the market with interesting, innovative concepts. A lot of them did not survive long enough. I truly hope that Pixii is here to stay for a long time. I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that they're shooting for such a niche market. Rangefinder, no LCD, etc. And there are many things to get right in terms of color science, in terms of sensor and how well it works with array of lenses. So I hope they're able to work through all of that. Who is this camera for? So I personally find it interesting to use cameras like this that are a little bit off the beaten path and they challenge myself. Several years back, I realized that most cameras are good enough for most photographers, and it's no longer a challenge to get a reasonable image under most conditions from a camera. That's where I started looking at Sigmas, and I have a few of those, at rangefinder, something that gives me more things to worry about when I do image taking, but also gives you a little bit more of a kind of pure deliberate experience. So, call me a masochist, but I actually enjoyed this form factor, I enjoyed this camera. I do not think this is gonna be appealing to mainstream for many reasons. The concept itself is niche. There are the special caveats that I mentioned that Pixii needs to work through. Camera is limiting. There is obviously no video, no other modern features. Again, nothing new to most rangefinder photographers who are not looking for them, but it is something that most other photographers expect to see in a camera. So, interesting product, interesting limitations, some surprising ones. Hopefully, we'll see some of them addressed in the future iterations.